It seems strange to be talking about parties and invitations right now, but even before we all began to shelter in place, I'm willing to bet that not many physical invitations were coming through your letterbox. This is no slight on your social circles. I am sure that your devices were full to brimming with evites, text meetup details, and Eventbrite invitations. But physical invitations today are mostly relegated to landmark events, baptisms, bar and bat mitzvahs, weddings, anniversary parties, carefully chosen stationery that's a pleasant surprise to open after so many bills, credit card offers, and charity solicitations. Some 250 years ago, a Pennsylvanian born man named Patterson Hartshorn was residing in colonial Antigua as an agent of his father's Philadelphia based merchant house when some servant, likely enslaved, arrived on his doorstep with a small invitation card requesting his presence at what was to be one of the most anticipated social events of the year on the island. At just 7 centimetres by 10 centimetres, the invitation card was neat and to the point, a decorative border framing the simple information: a ball by Mrs. Lindsay, the third day after the arrival of His Excellency General Woodley. The card was likely printed on a press supplied directly to Antigua as an entrepreneurial move by Benjamin Franklin. However, this paper is not about Franklin or Mrs. Lindsay, who along with her husband profited from the labour of captured enslaved Africans, or indeed Patterson Hartshorn. Instead, I am interested in how the material ephemera of white elite social life in colonial Antigua came to influence the social culture of Africans and their descendants, enslaved and freed. The survival of Mrs. Lindsay's 1768 invitation to Hartshorn is rare enough. I do not know of any surviving examples of paper invitation cards from the black population. Such invitations seem unlikely. Although there was never anti-literacy legislation in the British colonial Caribbean as there was in US slaveholding states, levels of literacy of enslaved people were still discouraged and kept low in the British colonial Caribbean due to white fears about the subversive and revolutionary potential of reading and writing. This did not mean that reading and writing were not desirable and pursued skills by the enslaved population, nor that enslaved and freed Africans and their descendants didn't in some cases use invitations for their social events. In the absence of the survival of those invitations, I want to use the invitation card for Mrs. Lindsay's ball as a stand-in for other invitations lost to climate, use, and time. What might the enslaved delivery person who delivered the invitation card to Patterson Hartshorn, probably a boy or young man, possibly liveried given the high status of the person who claimed to own him, have thought of the invitation? It is possible that an enslaved men working at the printing press set up by Franklin's associates were able to take home paper, excess or erroneous prints, or scrap from the business home. And at what point did the black invitational practice take hold on Antigua? In order to make a claim about black invitational practice, I need to work backwards in time from a claim made post-emancipation in 1844. The anonymous author of the 1844 Antigua and the Antigans, written in the long tradition of colonial travel narratives, was named locally as an English lady who married a coloured Creole of this island a few years since, during a visit he had made to England, and she was named as Mrs. Lanahan or Mrs. Flanagan. Alongside a history of Antigua, the author shared her experiences and impressions of the island. Writing about so-called Negro balls on the island, she took care to describe to her readers the novelty of the invitations given by the black hosts, writing that she had several cards of invite for the balls given by freed black people in front of her, explaining to her readers that cards of invitations are issued about 8 or 10 days before, and also that their invitations are written upon paper which had once been white, but alas, too many touches have tarnished its fair character. The next invitation which comes to my hand is traced upon that particular kind of green paper which we commonly see wrapped round quills in the stationer's shop windows in far-famed London. She goes on to make fun of the way the authors of the invitations mimic the language and the etiquette of the island's white elites. But her tantalizing description, although semi-written in jest, implies that paper was rare and valued by freed black people on Antigua, who must have carefully recycled and reused scraps of paper left over from other purposes for their invitations, and that this material culture may have come as a surprise to visitors such as the author and her audience back home in Britain and North America. Antigua, along with Bermuda, were the only two British colonies whose colonial governments decided to grant immediate freedom to enslaved people in 1834, when the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act came into force, rather than the transitionary 4 to 6 year period of forced indentured labour known as apprenticeship that was implemented in other British Caribbean colonies. Indeed, two US visitors, the Reverend James Thome and Joseph H. Kimball, were sent to Antigua in 1837 on behalf of the Executive Committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society in order to share the freedom experiment with the US. Like the author of Antigua and the Antiguans, these two visitors were surprised by the desire of newly freed populations to hold onto printed material and seeming scraps of paper. On visiting the huts in one village, formerly enslaved labourers, they noted that one of the finest looking huts was decorated with pictures, printed cards, and booksellers' advertisements in large letters. Among the many ornaments of this kind was an advertisement not unfamiliar to our eyes, The Girl's Own Book by Mrs. Child. Thome and Kimball's surprise at seeing a reference to a recent and popular New York publication, a light-hearted entertainment for young girls, in the home of a man so recently enslaved and so far from that world seemingly, seems to match Mrs. Lanigan's surprise at recognizing the paper from a London stationery shop repurposed by freedmen for their own entertainments. However, it speaks to the continuity of imported printed material and writing paraphernalia in Antigua. Although imported newspapers, booksellers' catalogues, ink, and paper may not have been imported to the British colonial Caribbean with enslaved and freed people in mind necessarily, the interdependence of different racialized groups in Antigua on an island of just over 100 square miles meant that it's almost certain that these materials circulated beyond the circles for which they were originally intended. Mrs. Lanigan and Thome and Kimball's accounts show that items that may have been seen as waste in Philadelphia or London, green paper to hold quills together, or booksellers' advertisements, were saved and repurposed as invitations, for example, and even cherished by African descendant populations. So what of Mrs. Lindsay's invitation to Patterson Hartshorne? I like to think of the unlikely survival to the present day of this slight piece of card as a stand-in for a lost archive of papers in the possession of enslaved and free Antiguans, a speculative jumping-off point, allowing us to imagine what these missing fragments might teach us. Of course, I am aware that there is a 75-year gap between Mrs. Lindsay's ball invitation and Mrs. Lanahan's observation of invitation cards written on pen wrappers. Between these periods, there was a huge amount of change in Antigua: growth in the population of mixed-race free people of colour, a growth in missionary Christianity, particularly a very strong Methodist presence on the island, the establishment of societies for the education and welfare of both enslaved and the poor white population, the banning of the transatlantic slave trade, and eventual emancipation. Alongside these developments were the founding of a newspaper edited by a free man of colour and, I would suggest, the development of a mainstream Afro-Caribbean paper-based circulation culture. Mrs. Lindsay's invitation can stand as what Wayne Modest and Tim Barringer call object lessons in often underexplored Caribbean material culture. Modest and Barringer write that such object lessons can be a means of exploring the complex entanglements that characterized colonial relations. At the same time, one could take Lindsay's invite card as an invitation to imagine the presence of a lost archive of Afro-Caribbean invitational practice that was not merely a docile mimicry of elite European dance culture and etiquette, but an assertion of the legitimacy of Black dance practices, and even a playful and knowing counter to invites such as Mrs. Lindsay's. Music historian Glenda Goodman explores the productive and even restitutionary value that such imaginative work may have in her work on musical books circulating among intertribal native communities in Connecticut, writing that, constructing a presence, even if a presence in speculative form of missing materials, is a small gesture towards reconstituting early American music studies to be more attentive to native agency and reciprocal influences within and across music cultures. I believe the same gesture holds in the colonial Caribbean context, and I look forward to continuing to critically fabulate and speculatively explore those imagined fragments from their traces.